Mr. President, I rise this evening to talk about the energy bill that's before the chamber right now. I want to thank Senator Murkowski and Senator Cantwell for bringing us to this point. This is called the Energy Policy Modernization Act. It's my understanding this is the first comprehensive energy bill to come to the floor of the Senate in 7 or 8 years. It's something that we ought to be focused on because it helps to create a better economy. It helps to ensure that we do have a protected grid, that we can indeed improve our infrastructure around the country in terms of energy. We can improve the performance of federal agencies. The bill also allows more exports of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is important to our economy. So by focusing on energy and making some common sense steps to help in terms of making our economy more efficient, we're going to help to create more independence here in this country, to make America less dependent on foreign sources of energy as well. So I commend them for that. I'm happy to support the broader legislation. Tonight, I'd like to talk about Title I of the bill. As those of you who've looked at the bill know, Title I is about energy efficiency. And I want to thank Senator Murkowski and Senator Cantwell for including the Portman-Shaheen Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act in as Title I of the legislation. This is energy efficiency legislation that has actually been to the floor a couple of times. We were not able to get it passed because of a disagreement over amendments. But it's come out of the committee with strong votes. In fact, the most recent vote was a few months ago when we reported the energy efficiency legislation out of our Energy Committee in the Senate by a vote of 20-2. That doesn't happen very often around this place. It's bipartisan because it makes sense. Senator Shaheen and I have worked with members of both sides of the aisle and groups all around the country over the past 4 or 5 years to put this legislation together. It's part of what I think is the right philosophy, which I see embodied in this overall legislation, which is we ought to be producing more energy in this country, but we also ought to be using it more efficiently. So producing more and using less is a good combination. It creates jobs. It creates the opportunity for us to be more competitive in global markets. It helps us to be less dependent on foreign oil, and it helps us to improve the environment. This legislation that we are looking at in Title I is going to get across the finish line this year, I believe, because we do have strong support from not just Republicans and Democrats here in this chamber, but people around the country who have helped us put this together. Those on this side of the aisle often talk about the need for all of the above energy strategy, and I like to talk about that. I think it's the right approach. I think we should be focusing on all of our energy resources. When you talk about all of the above, though, one of the best sources of energy is the energy you don't use. It's the energy that is really economically viable, and that's energy efficiency. We're pretty good at the produced part of the equation sometimes on my side of the aisle, but we need to focus more on the efficiency part. This legislation also helps the environment, as I said. It's actually the equivalent of taking about 20 million cars off the road within 15 years. Think about that. Through energy efficiency, it's the equivalent of taking about 20 million cars off the road within 15 years. And by the way, it doesn't do it by over-regulating. It doesn't do it by killing jobs. It doesn't do it by the heavy hand of government. It does it without any mandates, but instead incentives. Incentivizing less energy use will help to reduce emissions in a way that doesn't kill jobs. In fact, our legislation will create more jobs. We have a study of our legislation now showing that it's going to create 136,000 new jobs while saving consumers about $13.7 billion a year in reduced energy costs within 15 years. The bill is supported by 260 associations, businesses, advocacy groups, including the National Association of Manufacturers, the Sierra Club, the Alliance to Save Energy, the United States Chamber of Commerce. It's kind of a group that doesn't normally get together to support legislation, but they're all together on this because they understand the importance of it. That's one reason, again, this passed the committee with big bipartisan numbers, but it's also why it actually works, because we got input from everybody. It makes good economic sense, good energy sense, and good environmental sense. In visiting with job creators around Ohio, going to businesses, talking about this legislation, they're excited about it because it gives them the opportunity to have access to new energy efficiency technology that makes them more competitive. So it allows Ohio workers to be able to compete better with workers in places like Japan or Europe, where there's more of a focus on energy efficiency. It reduces the costs of production. This is why the manufacturing community in my home state of Ohio is really excited about it. They know this is going to help them to be able to be competitive. It also helps with regard to our federal government. You know, the federal government ought to practice what it preaches. And the federal government is the largest user of energy in the country, probably the largest user of energy in the world. And by the way, one of the more inefficient users of energy. So our legislation specifically goes after the federal government, talks about how we need to use less energy at our call centers, how we need to be sure that federal buildings are more energy efficient. Just by doing that alone, we're going to save taxpayers billions of dollars. That makes sense for taxpayers. It also makes sense for reducing emissions. It also makes sense to have our federal government be more efficient. The proposals contained in this bill are really common sense reforms. No mandates on the private sector. They come as a result of direct conversations we've had with people at the local level and businesses who understand how we can actually help without mandates to create incentives. Our legislation does focus on manufacturing. It does focus on the government and the General Services Administration and buildings. It also focuses on buildings to ensure that buildings are more efficient, both residential and commercial buildings, which is where we're going to see a lot of our savings. Again, this is not only going to create more jobs, it's going to save consumers a lot of money. It's been nearly 10 years since Congress passed legislation that focused on energy efficiency. A lot has changed and a lot needs to be updated. This legislation allows us to do that. It allows us to move forward in a smart way, in a bipartisan way, to ensure that, yes, we are producing more energy, becoming less dependent on foreign sources, more independent here in this country, helping our economy, but also doing so in a way that helps create a better environment for all of us. This is a true all-of-the-above energy strategy. Again, I applaud my colleagues for bringing forward the Energy Policy Modernization Act, and I thank them for including the Shaheen-Portman legislation. I want to particularly thank my partner, Jean Shaheen, from New Hampshire for her hard work over the years on this legislation. It's time for us to get it done. It's time for us to provide this incentive and give this economy a shot in the arm to help ensure that we can take advantage of our energy resources in this country, use them more efficiently, and by doing so, create more economic opportunity for everyone. Thank you, Mr. President.